C'est pour moi un grand plaisir et honneur d'être ici à ce colloque et de rendre un peu d'hommage, comme je le peux, à M. Fumaroli. Alors, je demande pardon pour parler en anglais, mais je pense que pour vous, les auditeurs, c'est mieux que je parle ma langue maternelle. Towards the end of his life, in the winter of 1637 to 38, Rubens painted this famous allegorical scene of the outbreak of war. The picture illustrates what becomes of the arts in time of war. Indeed, it sums up in dramatic visual terms the very theme of our colloque, the fate of the arts of peace in a Europe at war. For the mourning woman throwing up her hands is Europe herself, and the arts of peace, literature, architecture, and figurative art are represented as trampled and destroyed under the feet of the war god Mars. But let me go no further with my description of the picture, for I can give you Rubens' own words, since by good fortune the artist has left us an account of his subject in a letter of March 1638 to the man to whom he had sent the picture. He says, "The principal figure is Mars, who has left the temple of Janus open. This, in time of peace, according to Roman custom, remained locked, and rushes forth with shield and bloody sword, threatening the people with great disaster. He pays little heed to Venus, his mistress, who strives with caresses and embraces to hold him back, accompanied by her Amors and Cupids. From the other side, Mars is dragged forward by the Fury Alecto, with a torch in her hand, and two monsters next to her, symbolizing pestilence and famine, inseparable companions of war. On the ground, turned away, lies a woman with a broken lute, which denotes the harmony which is incompatible with the discord of war. There too is a mother with her child in her arms, to show that fecundity, procreation, and charity are thwarted by war, which corrupts and destroys everything. In addition, there is an architect thrown on his back with his instruments in his hand, to show that that which in time of peace is constructed for the use and ornamentation of the city is brought to ruin and hurled to the ground by the violence of armaments. I believe, if I remember rightly, that you will also find on the ground, under the feet of Mars, a book, as well as a drawing on paper, to imply that he treads underfoot literature and other fine things in life, altre galanterie. There should, in addition, be a bunch of darts or arrows with the band which held them together undone. This was, when bound together, the emblem of concord, and also the caduceus and olive branch, attribute of peace, which I have put lying there. The sorrowing woman clothed in black, with her veil torn and despoiled of all her jewels and different ornaments, is the unfortunate Europe, who for so many years now has suffered plunder, outrage, and misery, which are so injurious to everyone that I need not specify them. Her mark is the globe held by a little angel or genius, with a cross on top to signify the Christian world." As you see, Rubens' description, which was intended to arrive in advance of the picture, was written in Italian, even though his correspondent was a fellow Netherlander, the Flemish painter Justus Sustermans. But Sustermans had long been living in Italy and was working at court of Grand Duke Ferdinando II dei Medici. The Allegory is today one of the greatest treasures of Palazzo Pitti in Florence. For this reason, it was usually supposed in the past that it was made for the Grand Duke himself, and Sustermans was simply acting as his agent. This despite the fact that Rubens talks in his letter of the picture having been commissioned by Sustermans. He says he's doing it per suo servizio, and indeed thanks him for the payment which he has received in Antwerp, and also for the present of a book. And despite the fact that Filippo Baldinucci, who published Rubens's letter in his Life of Sustermans, and this is how we know this letter, tells us how gratified Sustermans was that his great contemporary should have responded to his request for something by his hand with such a wonderful picture, adding that the painting was coveted by and then bought for the Grand Ducal collection sometime after the death of Sustermans. But despite this evidence, people continued to believe it was made for the Grand Duke, that Baldinucci must be wrong. However, since the publication of Sustermans' inventory in 1981, it is known that Baldinucci was perfectly correct. Rubens' allegory entered the Medici collection only after the death of Sustermans at the end of the 17th century, when it was purchased by the heirs of the painter, from the heirs of the painter, sorry. The picture remained hanging in Sustermans' own house in pride of place. It's described, the only work in the inventory, as opera bellissima, among his extensive collection of pictures, and protected by a green curtain for more than 40 years before it went to the Medici, before he died. It's obvious then that Sustermans ordered the work from Rubens for himself and paid the substantial sum of money that Rubens quite justifiably asked for it. It's an enormous picture, all by Rubens' hand, more or less. But it remains difficult for some scholars to accept that this magnificent piece of pictorial rhetoric, created by an artist who for a time had engaged in diplomacy at the highest level in the courts of Europe, that this picture should have been done only for a fellow painter and for a private setting. And recent commentators remain wedded to the idea that it was really meant for a more public and political context and for the eyes of Ferdinando de' Medici. What is almost always agreed, however, is that the subject matter was Rubens' choice. Otherwise, why would he have needed to explain what it was about? And as has often been pointed out, the allegory is a development of motifs and themes that had occupied Rubens for most of his career, but particularly the last years of his life. Not long before he made this painting in 1635, the artist had been asked to design the pageantry to welcome into Antwerp the new Habsburg governor of the Netherlands, Cardinal Infante Ferdinand, brother of Philip IV. After the obligatory scenes welcoming Ferdinand and celebrating his military achievements, Rubens confronted him with a dramatic painted pageant of the Temple of Janus. In a famous passage in the Aeneid, Virgil had described the fury of war chained inside the temple, fuming with rage over the peace which keeps him shut in. In his pageant, Rubens showed Virgil's fury as a terrible figure who has burst his bonds and rages forth to bring devastation, it would seem, on the very spectators. Peace and her companions, among them the late Archduchess Isabella, the former governor of the Netherlandish provinces, are trying to restrain the fury of war and close the door. But discord and confusion intervene, shaking serpents and overturning pots of blood, scraggy famine and plague in the guise of death, and the cruelty of war itself in the person of a soldier dragging a mother by the hair from her infant child. This is all described by Rubens' friend Caspar Gevartius in the text to the lavish commemorative volume from which this illustration comes. The intended message to Ferdinand that he should follow the example of his predecessor Isabella is clear enough and was reinforced in words in the inscriptions devised by Gevartius. But as far as the central drama of the Pitti allegory is concerned, that is the struggle between the gentle, peace-loving Venus and Mars, god of war, spurred on by the Furies, an image, of course, also inspired by ancient poetry, by Lucretius in particular, but also statues. This was already in his mind when he painted the scene of the Council of the Gods from the life of Marie de Medicis, finished in 1625. This shows in mytho-allegorical terms the Queen's peace efforts during her regency through the marriages she arranged between the Dauphin, that is Louis XIII, and his sister to the Infanta and the Infante of Spain. All the gods of Olympus are assembled to approve the Queen's purpose, which is explained to them by Juno, patron of marriage, as she yokes together pairs of white doves, and white doves themselves are emblems of peace, familiar emblems. Here, given the success of the peacemakers in the picture, everything's going very well, Venus succeeds without great effort in restraining the warlike impulse of her lover Mars. But once again, I can pass you over to Rubens for an account of his subject, since a memorandum drawn up in August 1622 is based on the artist's own plan for his picture. It was written in Italian, but here we have it. The memorandum is in French. So, Jupiter et Junon consultent pour mettre l'Europe en repos par l'alliance de France et d'Espagne. Junon, comme déesse de mariage, met un joug d'or sur deux paires de colombes blanches. Il y a deux colombes tenues par Cupidon qui sont posées sur le globe du monde, parties en deux, où sont les armes de France et d'Espagne, avec l'assistance, la paix et la concorde. Apollo et Minerve chassent la discorde, la furie et la fraude qui veulent empêcher l'effet des mariages. Mars veut secourir les furies qui est retenue par Vénus. You will notice that peace and concord, who plead the case for the marriage, have the attributes that come to be trampled in the later allegory of war. The caduceus with its entwined serpents, which represents warring forces now united. This is in the hand of the figure of peace. Oops. Here we are. And the bundle of rods bound together. Singly, they are easily broken, but unbreakable when united. In a discreet bit of flattery, Rubens has given the matronly figure of peace a certain resemblance to Marie herself. It seems to have been Rubens who persuaded Marie de Medicis and her advisors that this subject should be made one of the three very large pictures introducing the second part of the life of the Queen with its celebration of her pro-Spanish peace policy. And in fact, while planning the monumental series of paintings in Paris in 1622 to 23, Rubens was engaged quietly in negotiations on behalf of the Archduchess, as I said, regent of the Spanish Netherlands, in the hope of a new rapprochement between France and Spain, especially important as the 12 years truce between the North and Southern Netherlands had just expired. Rubens had little success in promoting a Franco-Spanish alliance, which is hardly surprising given that he was facing the formidable opposition of Richelieu, who became cardinal in the summer of 1622, and whose inclinations were in a very different direction. He was conducting secret talks with the Protestant Dutch. But given the subsequent fate of Marie de Medicis, her downfall, exile, and flight from France, it is to the artist's credit as a diplomat as well as a painter that his celebration of her perhaps less than glorious life, with its many problematic episodes, has survived to entertain and astonish us today. A few years later, Rubens found himself working in a more official capacity as an emissary of the Spanish king. In 1628, Archduchess Isabella sent him to the court of her brother, Philip IV, in the first place to make portraits for her and deliver a group of paintings for the royal palace of the Alcazar in Madrid, but also to receive instructions for his next mission, which was to England, where he was to try to negotiate a peace treaty between Spain and Charles I. Isabella had to work hard to persuade her brother Philip that a mere artist was a fit person to treat on behalf of Spain. Of course, Rubens had qualifications for this job that were not usually found in even the most cultivated artist. He was highly educated, politically informed, and well connected with significant figures in the République des Lettres throughout Europe, especially in Italy, France, and the Dutch provinces of the Netherlands. He read Latin easily and had knowledge of Greek. Moreover, he was fluent in Italian, the medium of diplomacy at the period, and as you saw, it was in Italian he wrote to Sustermans. This is the language of most of his surviving letters, though there are some in French. He could write French. Charles I of England was in fact delighted to receive the artist, whose work he already admired. Charles wanted Rubens to paint a glorification of the achievements and ideals of his father, James I, for the ceiling of the banqueting house in Whitehall in London. And this project was firmly planned during Rubens's visit to England. And I'll show you here the sketch for the central panel of the banqueting house, Rubens' first rough idea. Over the 10 months that Rubens stayed in London, the truce was agreed despite many obstacles. And as a tribute to his diplomatic efforts, the artist was awarded, on the one hand, an honorary degree by the University of Cambridge, Master of Arts, and on the other hand, he was knighted by the king. He was also presented with jewels and other gifts. Rubens, in turn, presented the king with an allegory of peace and war, a document to the treaty agreement and the hopes that stemmed from it. It was painted while the negotiations were going on in London, and it was made on Rubens' own initiative. It wasn't commissioned, it was a gift for the king. I think it has no parallel in the history either of art or of diplomacy. The painting shows Minerva, goddess of wisdom, firmly escorting the war god Mars, his thunderclouds, and his dark hissing furies away from the rustic haven of peace. Peace sits full and white, squirting milk from her breast at a plump baby, while two women enter from the left, one bearing riches, the other dancing to a tambourine, and a satyr, the symbol of abundance, offers a brimming cornucopia to a group of children. The idea is, from peace comes prosperity and abundance, in the familiar Renaissance theme, ex pace ubertas. It had long been Minerva's job to expel unpleasant forces in Renaissance art. In fact, she is the only woman who can single-handedly take on a man, even the fiercest of men, Mars. Rubens would have known that she was the one goddess who vanquished the god of war in the 5th book of the Iliad. Minerva is a complex character in art of the Renaissance, combining aspects of wisdom and prudence as well as fortitude and strength. We saw her in the Council of the Gods, expelling the advocates of war, and here she has the help of Apollo. She was to have a similar role on the Whitehall ceiling, and here you have a sketch for one of the panels where this is about the peaceful rule of James I. You see peace and abundance embracing while Minerva is pushing down Mars out of the way. In the London allegory for Charles I, Rubens' Minerva has her traditional helmet, which gives her a certain authority and advantage, especially given the fact that, as you see, Mars is not wearing his. She has rolled up her sleeve for the task and shows off her muscles. The light falls on her slightly flushed face. She's certainly giving Mars a good push with her bent right arm. But this in itself would hardly be enough to make him leave. When Minerva really has to fight Mars, Rubens sensibly gives her Hercules as well to help, as we see in this very rough sketch made in the late 1630s. I'll come back to this work. In the London allegory, The god Mars, fortunately, seems to have realized that he's not wanted and he should leave. It is as if the arrival of the blessings of prosperity make it clear to him that he has to go. But he is also impelled out of the scene by the natural logic of the composition. He belongs with the dark forces of war, the fury with her screaming mandrake root, that's what this thing is she's holding, I think, and the nasty little harpy, which Rubens used elsewhere to symbolize the evils of war. And I'm showing you here a detail, and also a detail from the Allegory of War in Florence, where you see the same characters, but in a different role, not disappearing, but pulling Mars. As the cloudy sky of war in the painting in London is replaced by clear blue, it's clearer in the real picture, through the bright sunlight of peace, Mars is impelled to disappear, to follow the cloud. He cannot tolerate the light which so brightly illumines the body of nursing peace. Apollo is present as a driving force, even if he is not personified here. Into this allegorical wonderland of peaceful abundance, excuse me, Cupid and Hymenaeus, the god of marriage, conduct two little girls in contemporary dress. They are real portraits we know from other portraits of them. They are the daughters of the English painter and diplomat Balthazar Gerbier, with whom Rubens lodged during part of his stay in London. Rubens painted the allegory while he was in his house. In fact, it may have started as a gift for Gerbier, and Rubens may then have decided it would be perhaps when the peace treaty was achieved, that it should be for Charles instead. This anecdotal reference enlivens the ancient theme on which Rubens based the central figure, for here he illustrated a concept of peace that was particularly meaningful to him, one that's associated with marriage, babies, Rubens loved painting babies, and children. It is children, after all, not adults, whether real or personified, who are shown as the special recipients of the benefits of peace. And they are being introduced to this by Hymen, the youthful god of marriage. Well, the idea Rubens had in mind was that of Irene Kourotrophos, peace, the nurse of children, and mistress of marriages, despoina gamon in the Greek. This idea and its converse, that war is the enemy of maternity, fecundity, and children, is essentially an ancient Greek, not a Roman one. It is expressed in Homer, in Hesiod, and significantly in the anti-war dramas of Aristophanes. Now, it might seem for this reason that it's somewhat obscure as a source, but as I've indicated, Rubens was uniquely educated among Renaissance artists, and virtually uniquely could actually read Greek texts. Indeed, they are cited in the commentary to the Temple of Janus pageant by his friend Gevartius, with reference to their babies popping out of cornucopias. Peace, he says, is the mistress of marriage and nurse of children, and war is the enemy of fertility, fecundity, and love, as indeed he is in the allegory in the Pitti Palace. Around the same time as he was evolving this allegory, Rubens, that he sent to Sustermans, Rubens painted almost on the same very large scale a massacre of the innocents for, as I've discovered, his friend Bishop Triest of Ghent. This picture is a wonderful evocation of a Christian story of martyrdom and tragic passion. But it's also a scene of the brutality of soldiers and, by implication, of the cruelty of war. There are clear echoes with the imagery of the Pitti allegory, with its trampled mother and child. Most of all, the woman who, like the Matrona representing Europe, raises her arms in anguish and despair. Significantly, both of these figures are dressed in contemporary fashion, in the fashion of the 1630s, in a rich robe torn open at the breast. The great historian Jakob Burckhardt called the Allegory of War the immortal and unforgettable frontispiece to the 30 Years' War. Many commentators since have echoed Burckhardt's words and often quoted alongside it statements Rubens made at various times to correspondents, including the Spanish chief minister Olivares, that he had always worked for peace. Recently, there has been a backlash against what is seen as a sentimentalizing and idealizing view of Rubens as man of peace. This is fair enough, and some art historians have detailed instances where Rubens expressed approval of military actions and have presented a robustly cynical analysis of his utterances, commenting, for example, that one should never take a diplomat at his word, at least when he is writing in a political context. Okay, but still, not this allegory. The German scholar Ulrich Heinen seems reluctant to take Rubens at his word in any context. He's proposed that the allegory of peace, of war, is no less than a call to arms, a piece of Habsburg propaganda, designed to enlist Tuscan support for the righteous Habsburg side against the Dutch provinces. He imagines that Rubens and Sustermans were combining together to enlist the Grand Duke to the Habsburg cause. He even supposes that the figure Rubens calls Europe is actually Antwerp, since, he assumes, it was the Netherlandish war that mattered to Rubens and Sustermans and not the war in Germany or the fate of Europe as a whole. Well, this ignores the fact that in his letters, Rubens often talks about the fate of Europe. In fact, he does so even in the text about the Medici cycle. But much more importantly, this interpretation does violence not only to Rubens' description, it contradicts the logic of the picture and the story we can reconstruct of its evolution. As I've indicated, the composition relates closely to and seems to be a development of one in which Rubens shows Minerva and Mars and Hercules battling against Mars. I've shown you this sketch already, and we know variations on it, some of them copies by Rubens' pupils, such as this one in the Louvre. Here, Mars is shown dragging a mother by the hair, the very image of the cruelty of war, Saevitias Militaris, that had been illustrated on the Temple of Janus pageant. And I show you here now a detail from Rubens' sketch for the pageant, along with the rough sketch, which is in Antwerp. In this composition, Mars is also trampling emblems and representatives of the arts. It's not very easy to see, but there's a lute, an architect, the elements which appear in the Pitti allegory. This sketch, I should perhaps say, has not been attributed to Rubens by everyone because it's kind of rough, but I believe Rubens did it towards the end of his life. He was suffering from arthritis, and I think that's the reason. I believe it is by Rubens. Anyway, the composition is certainly Rubens's. On Minerva's side, above her head, and apparently in opposition to Mars, is an eagle grasping a thunderbolt, the familiar symbol of military power, which in modern contexts Rubens often associated with the Habsburgs. The point would seem to be that imperial might should do its best to strive against war from a position of strength. It's worth remembering that in the emblematic surround Rubens designed for the portrait of Olivares, Rubens featured the attributes of the same gods as appear in the sketch, Minerva and Hercules. Olivares, by the way, much appreciated this invention of Rubens. And I suspect the composition of Hercules and Minerva, opposing Mars, may have been planned for an eminent Spanish client, perhaps in fact the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand, as a sort of reinforcement of the theme of the Temple of Janus. If so, the resulting picture has either been lost or never came to anything. But its theme evolved into the allegory in Florence. Minerva's pushing becomes Venus's vain attempt at pulling. The active intervention of strength, wisdom and virtue's strength, Minerva and Hercules, turns into the tears and appeals of helpless women. Even more than in the sketch with Hercules and Minerva, this is a visual argument against war and its evils. Still, by contrast with that composition, it represents the failure of diplomacy. Venus's blandishments are of no avail. The caduceus of Mercury, god of peace and also of diplomacy, is trampled. Mercury and Minerva are the gods of diplomacy in Rubens' art. And there is no sign of the strong-armed Minerva. Moreover, rather than being about his own divided country, the Netherlands, it's a lament for Europe as a whole. It is Europe who is mourning, and she raises her hands and eyes to heaven in despair at the fate of the innocent victims of war. It's not been emphasized, just 1 minute, how significant it is that Rubens should have personified Europe rather than the Netherlands or any other specific country, and that he should have represented her the way he did. It was only in the later 16th century that Rubens began to be illustrated at all as a personification, almost always in prints and frontispieces, and in relation to the three other parts of the world, as the mistress and queen of her three more or less underprivileged sisters. Rubens's Europe is one of the first appearances of Europa in an allegorical painting, and the first in which she appears on her own in a narrative context. You can see how his figure, though richly dressed, is far from being an embodiment of Habsburg imperium. She has no attributes of power, no scepter and imperial crown, but a simple mural crown of the sort given in antiquity to provinces and cities. She has, however, the attributes of maternity. She is a mother in mourning for her lost children, and of Christianity. It seems obvious that Rubens' picture is a lament for the tragedy of the war that has engulfed Christendom. Far from being an expression of narrow national or Habsburg interest, it makes a universal appeal, bypassing to confessional difference. It was in Protestant Germany, which in the 1630s suffered most from the depredation of the 30 Years' War, that the image of a suffering Europe first made her appearance in certain political prints, such as this one. There's good reason to think that Rubens was aware of this imagery, especially since he was also reading the account of recent history published by the German Protestant Matthäus Merian. It's found in the library of his son, which argues for Europe as a Christian unity. Rubens had retired from diplomacy when he made this great picture, disappointed at the results of his efforts as a diplomat. In fact, even his successes had produced no lasting result. It was now as one painter to another and as one man to another that he sought to communicate, to express the frustration and despair he felt about the fate of Europe. It's interesting, too, that although the arts are trampled as appropriate to a fellow artist, it is the damage to human feelings and human relationships that Rubens' picture really emphasizes by the very use of the device of personification. And at the same time, had it not been for his relative failure as a diplomat, he might never have come to paint this moving image for a fellow artist. Thank you.